Good evening, and thank you all for attending the University of Richmond's 6th Last Lecture Series event, hosted by the Omicron Delta Kappa's Epsilon Circle. My name is Madison Nguyen. I am president of the ODK Epsilon Circle, and I have the honor of introducing tonight's speaker. The concept of a last lecture originates from Carnegie Mellon University's late professor Randy Pausch, who delivered his last lecture titled Really Achieving Your Childhood Dreams on September 18, 2007. In memory of Dr. Pausch, universities all over the country host last lecture series events where they ask esteemed professors to deliver lectures based on the following criteria. If you were to deliver a lecture that would be your last, what would you say? We are honored that Dr. Jessica Flanigan accepted our invitation to be this year's lecturer. Dr. Flanigan is an assistant professor of leadership studies and philosophy, politics, economics, and law here at the University of Richmond. She teaches ethical decision-making in healthcare, leadership ethics, and critical thinking. She received her master's in political science from Washington State and her PhD in political philosophy from Princeton University. Dr. Flanigan's research addresses topics such as medical paternalism, economic freedom, leadership ethics, and public health ethics. She recently completed a book defending patients' rights to self-medicate, including patients' rights to use drugs without prescriptions and usage of unapproved drugs. Dr. Flanigan's current research includes a defense of the basic income, a series of essays about philosophical methodology and applied ethics, a conscious analysis of disability rights, and a book project defending the legalization of sex work. She is also a proponent of effective altruism. Dr. Flanigan, thank you for being present this evening, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to ODK for honoring me with this introduction, for everybody for coming, and Julia and Steve for organizing this event. So thanks, everybody. When I was asked to prepare this lecture, first it was like a little unnerving because I'm going up for tenure this year, so it's like, what are you trying to say? But once I got over my anxieties about that, I knew that I wanted to talk about a philosophical topic. I really took it seriously. I thought, if I was going to give my last lecture, I'd give a lecture on the thing that I like lecturing about all the time, which is philosophy. And I knew that I would want to make an attempt at presenting some kind of original research. So that's what this is. And the reasons why I wanted to try to present some active original research should be clear from the content of the lecture, which is sort of about why that's so important to me. So this is sort of a work in progress of like a paper or a piece of research that I'm trying to develop. I also took the prompt of this lecture really literally. So when I first got the invitation, Seth I was talking to him and he joked, so is your last lecture just going to be about how death is really bad? And I said, yes, it would. He seemed kind of surprised. I was like, that is what I would think if it was my last lecture. I'd be terrified about that. And I also wanted to say something personal, but also universal, something that was relatable outside of my own experiences. And so that's why I'm talking about what the badness of death can teach us about the meaning of life, and what the meaning of life can teach us about morality. So just a warning, the lecture is going to be kind of dark in the beginning, so get ready. Glad you came. But hopefully by the end of the lecture, we'll create a bit of light as well. So let's start off. This is my overview. I have 3 goals in this lecture. First, I'm going to talk about why death is bad. Then I'm going to talk about the meaning of life. And then I'm going to talk about the relationship between the meaning of life and moral questions. and how it's not as straightforward as some have thought. First, death. The Lucretian paradox. The ancient Roman philosopher Lucretius argued that since people do not regret having not existed before their births, it's also a mistake to fear death or to regret one's future non-existence. So Lucretius wrote, "Look back at the eternity that has passed before we were born and mark how utterly it counts to us as nothing." Like, how many people here care about their previous non-existence before their own births? Like, not in any real meaningful way. "This is a mirror that nature holds up to us," he wrote, "in which we may see the time that shall be after we are dead. Is there anything terrifying in that sight? Anything depressing? Anything that is not more restful than the soundness of sleep?" So if death strikes us as terrifying or depressing, Lucretius argues, it shouldn't. On his view, people who are indifferent to their past non-existence should also not fear their future non-existence, because to do so would be to be making an arbitrary mistake. There's a paradox here. And so to avoid the paradox that Lucretius raises for us, and to justify our intuition that death is actually bad, we must either embrace the view that our future non-existence is not a tragedy for the same reason that our past non-existence is not a tragedy, or we must explain why there's a justified asymmetry between our past and our future non-existence. Or I suppose that you could now just come to lament the fact that you haven't existed since the beginning of time. So there's three ways to avoid that paradox, and I'm going to argue that we should justify that kind of an asymmetry. Here's another view of death that might challenge the view that death is so bad in itself. That's Derek Parfitt, and he is a philosopher who recently died. And he also argued that it's a mistake to regret your future non-existence, your own death in particular. So Parfitt's reason for this claim was that the self was an illusion. So we are only a series of temporally connected mental states anyhow. On his view, the thing that matters for each person's survival is whether the constellations of memories and intentions and experiences and beliefs that constitute their psychology persist through time. That's why intuitively a person could survive, for example, like being teleported and reconstituted atom for atom on Mars, even though their body would be obliterated, right? As long as the psychology was preserved, the person would be preserved. Or like imagine that your psychology was downloaded onto like a robot brain. Then you could survive even though in some sense your body might have died, right? But a person would not survive the total cessation of their mental life, even if their body persisted. So imagine if inside of your brain, your psychology was wiped totally clear and like a baby psychology was reborn inside of your body. On that view, you would not have survived that kind of event. Thinking about what matters for survival in this way, Parfitt suggested, means that we can better understand the nature of death, which, after all, we should just understand death as not surviving. If we think about what matters for survival as the persistence of our psychology, then in some sense, we are not surviving our lives all the time as we live it today. So, after all, you might think like our psychological states are changing all the time, memories fall away. Consider the person that you are now. That person is so radically different than the child that you were. And in a very real sense, the child that you once were has not survived. Parfitt described settling on this view in what's my favorite book. It's called Reasons and Persons. It's the best book. You should read it. I will recommend that to you. My first piece of advice here. And he wrote, when he thought about this view, he said, "My life seemed like a glass tunnel through which I was moving faster every year, at the end of which there was darkness. When I changed my view and came to think about the psychological view of survival, the walls of my glass tunnel disappeared. I now live in the open air." So Parfitt's initial view from the inside of the tunnel is the intuitive view. It's the view that we are distinct persons and we will survive until we don't. Parfitt's new view in the open air is a revisionary view to our ears. But this view has a long tradition. It's not as revisionary as it might seem. Some Buddhists, for example, have a doctrine called nada, which is the view that our self is also an illusion. So Nagasena, a Buddhist monk, wrote that the self is just some concept that we've made up to describe a certain collection of mental properties or physical properties. Like the concept of a chariot is like a really useful way of describing a collection of wheels and boards or whatever. I don't really know what a chariot's made of, but something like that. So these are two views of death and survival by contemporary philosophers, but also which date back thousands of years. And they cast doubt on the intuitive view that death is bad for the person who dies, or that death is as bad as we typically think it is. On an intellectual level, confronted with these views, you might appreciate that these views raise some good points, but you might nevertheless, despite me having presented to you some interesting views about the philosophy of death, maintain the intuition that death is still as harmful as you initially thought it would be. So for the rest of this lecture, I'm going to try to show why Lucretius was mistaken and what this can tell us about how we should live. So maybe it's obvious to you already that Lucretius was mistaken, but so you might be thinking, like, why do we need philosophy to explain to us, like, the badness of death? That just seems intuitive. Death's probably bad in lots of ways. But for philosophy, simple truths are never as simple as they seem. And the Lucretian and Buddhist views illustrate this point. And when you go through why simple views are false, you can actually learn a lot by trying to really explain why something that you thought all along is actually in fact true. So it's still worth considering why death is bad, even if you intuitively hold it all the same. There are at least two prominent views of the badness of death. We'll call them the deprivation view and the interest view. So Clint Eastwood's character in Unforgiven, noted philosopher, summarized the deprivation view when he said, there's a quote, I'm not going to do a Clint Eastwood voice because that would be really humiliating for me, but just imagine it in a Clint Eastwood voice. He says, it's a hell of a thing killing a man. You take away all that he's got and all that he's ever going to have. On this view, death is bad because it deprives people from experiencing all of the good things in life. Here's another philosopher. His name's Ken Chung, a less prominent philosopher than Parfitt, I think it's safe to say. But he wrote a blog while he was dying of pancreatic cancer, which is the same form of cancer that killed the last lecturer, Randy Pouch. On his blog, Chung wrote, there is no great payoff in the end for fighting cancer, bravely or with apparent wisdom. I will be dead and I will no longer exist to enjoy whatever gains there were to be had. Cancer, you will take everything from me eventually, but not yet, you fucking asshole. That's the deprivation view as well, right? That when we're confronted with the prospect of our own mortality, we're confronted with the prospect of something that will truly, it seems to us, take everything from us. Chung's story also illustrates the truth of the interest view, though. The view that says that death is bad because it frustrates important interests, like the interest in continuing to live and all of the other interests that require that we continue to live. Both of these views can be true at the same time. The harmful character of death, I think, is bad for the person who dies, and it also frustrates the interest of the person who dies. So on my view, it's not necessarily that death is bad because it makes a person worse off, because after all, after a person dies, there's no person who could be worse off after all. So that's like the Lucretian and the Parfitt point and the Buddha point. So if there's no person, there's no one who can be badly off. But death is bad because it's a frustration of one's plans. So I think that this diagnosis of the badness of death, that death is bad because it frustrates a person's plans, it really captures the intuitive force behind both of these views, the deprivation view and the interest view. That's the true injustice of living in a world where people are mortal in this way. So it's worth noting that neither of these views are always true. So at some point, a person's death might deprive her of nothing of value, and she might lack an interest in continuing to live. So I'm not saying that every death is a tragedy, but I'm saying that in these cases, even if a death isn't bad, the circumstances that preceded it, such that that was the case, those are bad in the same way. So why does any of this matter? Why did I just spend the first third of this lecture bumming out everybody by talking about death and how death is horrible and why death is bad and why it's worse than you thought? So I kind of didn't mean to bum out the whole room, but it is worth thinking about. Like, we don't think about the badness of death very often, or we try not to. And I think that because we don't think about that in our minds, we might lose sight of what it means to be alive, or how valuable it is to be alive, or how special and what a privilege it is that we are alive at this time for this amount of time. And we lose sight of what it means to survive. So thinking about the badness of death, thinking about our own mortality, can prompt us to really consider, like, what is it about our lives and what is about surviving that makes life meaningful? So my main thesis for the talk is that future-oriented projects are the things that make life meaningful. And that's why we have this feeling that death frustrates the meaning of our lives, because it deprives us of our futures and it frustrates our future-oriented plans. This is the reason why people rationally feel a sense of meaninglessness or dread when they consider the fact that people are mortal. This is the reason why thinking about mortality makes people feel a sense of futility, or what philosophers call the absurd, right? When we are confronted with these types of feelings about death, we think, what's the point of anything, right? But it would be a mistake, I think, to infer from these observations about death that a meaningful life is in fact out of reach, or that it's absurd to live because everybody's life is mortal. After all, if there were nothing meaningful about a person's specific life, then it wouldn't be rational to feel that so much was lost when a person passed away. It's precisely because people's lives are generally so filled with meaning and value that the end of any life is such a tragedy. So, what makes a life meaningful? And what does that question even mean? Maybe we can get a grip on this question by thinking of lives that lack meaning. So when philosophers talk about meaningless lives or pointless ones, they give examples such as a person who spends her whole life counting blades of grass, or someone who devotes their life to reading the telephone book over and over again, right? That, we think, oh, that would be a meaningless life. Some people think that meaningful lives are just those that are ethical lives, or lives that contribute to more value in the world, or that a pointless or a meaningless life is one that just causes suffering on balance or contributes nothing good. I feel like you can use the word meaning in that way, but that sort of misses the point, right? Because we already have a question of ethics. Like, we can already answer questions about what's ethical. And what's meaningful intuitively when we ask that question is supposed to denote some kind of separate category. So that's distinctive from ethics. So like, morality is an important value. It's a value that I teach people about, that like I teach the ethics class. I love ethics, I love morality. It's not the only value. The opposite of a meaningful life isn't an evil life, right? The opposite is a pointless life. It has to be conceptually possible to me that a terrible person could have a very meaningful life, or that a very good person could have a totally pointless life. So I don't think that we should rule out the possibility that meaning and ethics are different things just by definition. Instead, I think we should think about meaninglessness as a kind of pointlessness and reflect on why our own sense of meaning in life is so threatened by the thought of our own mortality. So mortality threatens our sense of meaning, I think, and it makes life sort of seem absurd because it gives us the sense that all of our investments will wind up without paying any kind of returns. But that sense is a mistake. We make this mistake because we are too focused on our own experiences. We think that when we stop having experiences of our lives, that the value of our lives ceases as well. But when we change our perspective and we think about the people who we've known and lost and the ways in which they persist in our lives, it shows us that our own lives can also be meaningful despite the fact that all life is fleeting in this way. There's a philosopher named Samuel Schaeffler, and he has a thought experiment to illustrate this point. Imagine that I told you that you are going to live a long and happy life and you're going to die peacefully. Yay. Good, you're happy. Sure. And then, bad news, here's the bad news. The Earth and all of its inhabitants will be destroyed 30 days after your death in a collision with a giant asteroid. How would that thought experiment affect you? How would it affect you to know that you would live out your life, have a natural death, surrounded by family, just your best case scenario, you're like 100, and then 30 days afterwards the Earth will be obliterated? Would that change anything about how you lived your life? Schaeffler thinks it should. It prompts us to see that our lives today are meaningful in part because we're a part of something bigger. And when that bigger something is threatened, the meaning of our own lives is threatened as well. So the fact that we're part of something that will persist for a long time after our own lives is what he calls the afterlife. It doesn't have to be a supernatural afterlife like heaven or hell. We can have an afterlife here on Earth, but some kind of an afterlife, like our earthly afterlife, is necessary to preserve our sense of purpose and meaning. I think this too. So I think meaningful lives require a future, and that this view of the meaning of life answers the Lucretian paradox by explaining why there is a difference between our future non-existence and our past non-existence. Before we existed, we weren't engaged in any future-oriented projects because we didn't exist. there was nothing, so there was nothing of meaning. The value of our lives isn't in the experiences, which Lucretius was right to point out. We lacked equally before we existed as we do when we die. The value of life is in projects, which only begin to form after we are born. Or, yeah, basically after we're born. This approach to meaning also addresses the seemingly revisionary implications of Parfitt's view, which is the view about what matters for survival. Remember the psychology guy? So say that the thing that matters for each person's survival is whether their constellation of memories and intentions and experiences persists through time. It might be that that's what matters for survival in some way, but that doesn't mean that death isn't so bad, because death nevertheless seems to destroy that thing that matters more than ordinary psychological change does over the course of a life. But Parfitt's insight is really helpful to help us see how we can preserve a little bit of what matters for survival even when we're gone. And that is by investing our efforts and our desires and our identities in things that will persist after we're gone, investing our psychologies in things that will outlive us in some sense. So what we ought to care about for survival is the persistence of something close or close enough to our own identities. What we should do to survive then is to construct our identities in ways that persist beyond ourselves. I'm sharing this perspective on death and meaning with you because the most valuable experiences of my own life have been meaningful in just this way. And these are the kinds of things that have made me feel like my life has been worth living so far. And these are the things that guide my choices in trying to live a life worth living as I go forward. I think of people who are wondering how to live lives of purpose and meaning, and I think that they should consider certain kinds of projects. These projects include raising children, contributing to collective endeavors, and participating in communities of ideas. I've been so privileged to have such a wonderful life, and I just want to share with you the insights of what are the things that I think have made my life so meaningful to me. And I think that, we should just talk about what's valuable in a life more often. So let's talk about them. That's me and my family. I'm pregnant, so I have another kid now. I'm not pregnant now, I'm pregnant in the picture. So I have another kid now. But that's us outside of Ryland Hall. Yay. So that's what these are my recommendations to you from reflecting on the meaning of life. I told, just an aside, Julian Hader was like, he did the last lecture a couple years ago, what are you gonna do your last lecture about? And I was like, the meaning of life. And then he said a word that began with S. He was like, oh man, but I think we can talk about the meaning of life. I think there is an answer. I'm gonna tell you about it. Here's part of it. Kids. Look how cute these kids are. These are my kids. They're cute, right? You have to say it because I'm standing up here. Yeah, there you go. So the first source of meaning is through contributing to the world by raising children. So my friend Chris right there, he'd probably be like, there's an evolutionary reason. Is that what you were thinking, Chris? That we find this to be so meaningful? Yes. Yeah, there he is. Yeah, so my friend Chris would say there's probably an evolutionary reason that I find so much meaning in having children, and I find that to be the most meaningful project of my life. Probably, but that doesn't make it any less real. There's an evolutionary reason behind why we love each other, but that doesn't mean that love is an illusion in any sense. I think having children is one of the primary sources of meaning, or raising children. It doesn't have to be your own, but investing in future people is one of the primary sources of meaning in life. And, it's worthwhile and important, even if it is in some sense what we're programmed to do by evolution in part. So every new person in the world that is created, think about it, experiences a whole lifetime of joy and wonder and satisfaction and learning and beauty and pleasure. And, there's hardships like there is in every single person's life, but almost every person that's created has a life worth living. Even people who were born in, the past, the past was a horrible place, but they still had lives that were worth living. Even people who were born into difficult circumstances have lives worth living. I think it seems fashionable lately for people to suggest that having children's a moral mistake, or having children's a mistake to the meaning of your life or something. There's these people who we might call in philosophy anti-natalists, right? Anti-natalists are anti-having kids people. And they think this because there's so many problems in the world, like the environment, or because people are exposed to hardships when they're born. But people who create or raise new people, I think, are doing an extraordinary service, not only to themselves and to the meaning of their own lives, but to the people they bring into the world in the first order, and also to the rest of humanity by providing all of us with the necessary conditions for a life worth living in this Schaeffler way. But they're creating the afterlife that we all rely on. I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't acknowledge the potential challenges associated with population increase going forward, but I'm saying that it is a disservice to all of us to disparage the project of having and raising children, since children are not only benefited by their own creation, but they enrich their lives of their parents and their lives of future generations and everybody else. So the next book that I'm starting is a book defending having children, which is an exciting project, which I'd love to talk to you guys more about. And I'll get in a minute to why I think writing books is also a pretty meaningful thing you can do. But first, collective endeavors. That's the second source of meaning in a life. And here I'm talking about things like extended families, religious traditions, cultural identities. By contributing to greater collective projects like this, we can shape our communities in ways that will outlive us. And in a small way, through that, we will live through our communities. So I'm a very individualist person. I'm generally very skeptical of the value of groups and group identities, especially because I think groups are often really responsible for moral atrocities like exclusion or prejudice or intolerance. But thinking about how people find meaning in their lives has led me to have a much greater appreciation for why people do join with groups and why people identify with groups and why groups can have a value for people and why people feel so strongly about preserving their cultures and traditions when they're under threat. I've gained a lot more sympathy as I've grown older in understanding why people invest so much in group identities, because that's a form of identity that you can reliably contribute to, which will reliably outlive you. But the group I favor is a kind of a different way to find meaning in a person's life, and that's by investing in a community of art or a community of ideas. And in this way, even if nobody ever remembers your name, even if nobody ever remembers your specific idea or your beliefs or your values, all of your efforts can still persist if you participate in the progression of ideas. And this is why I love my job so much. I love participating in a conversation that dates back to the very beginning of language and that will continue to the end of it. I love getting students to join that conversation too and making them excited about joining that conversation. On the day before he died, Derek Parfitt, remember him? Submitted a paper to a philosophy journal, and that paper was published this September. In this way, it was like Parfitt was still with us. People will talk about Parfitt's ideas for generations, but since his ideas were so influenced by hundreds and hundreds of philosophers whose names will not be known, in a way, their identities will persist as well for generations and beyond then. So, in a way, even if people's names are forgotten, they're still with us through the ideas that we're using and the values that we hold today. This isn't just unique to philosophy, which is my community of ideas. It's also true of mathematics and medicine and science and any innovative endeavor at all. It's true of the community that I've been lucky to join here at U of R. It's the Jepson School. Look at us. Wait, yeah, there's some of you there. That's why education, I think, is such a privilege and such a source of meaning for people's lives. So this community of ideas is one of the most inclusive and robust, meaningful projects that we should protect and pursue. So that's the value I find in things like the last lecture or writing this book about having kids. In contrast, the relationship between meaning and death may become even more vivid when we consider what we might consider to be lives that are wasted. So, on my view, the greatest threat to a meaningful life is excessive procrastination. You know who you are. Procrastination is just trading the year for the day, selling a future-oriented project for a non-project. And I say this as somebody who procrastinates all the time. It's not that procrastination's always bad. We all do it. It's just that a life of procrastination is, in a very real sense, a life that has completely missed the point. There are other ways besides procrastination for a life to be less meaningful. So think about the grass counter, for example. Actually, that image that I used of a grass counter is a professor of natural resources who's calculating grass density. That's actually a really meaningful project. He's on the right track. Or if the grass counter were engaged in a project of performance art as an art project to like change our notions of performance, great. Or if he was trying to make a point of the meaning of life by embodying this philosophical thought experiment, you do you, grass counter. But if the grass counter was engaged in none of these types of projects, he also would have wasted such an opportunity in a very real sense, and he would have missed the point. When the grass counter died, a grass counter could have had a life that was full of pleasure and peace, that never hurt anybody, but it would have been a mistake to say that that life wasn't lacking in some way. Clarification. I want to clarify what I'm not saying about the meaning of life. It might seem that I'm saying that people should just pursue projects and aim to achieve things, and that I'm sort of like buying into this like achievement-oriented ideology. So some philosophers like Kiran Satia, that's him, will say that viewing your life in an excessively goal-oriented way is also alienating and absurd, in the same way that not viewing your life in a goal-oriented way could be a kind of alienation. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. So I'm not saying that you should treat your whole life as if it's instrumental to some series of goals and accomplishments. I don't think you should live your life like you're checking off the boxes in Grad Tracker. That would be a sad way to live. It's a sad way to live right now, if that's how you're living and approaching your education. What I'm saying is that the foregoing argument about the meaning of life is an argument about treating your life as intrinsically valuable. It's a good in itself. So you should try to aim to preserve as much about what's good in life as you possibly can, despite the fact that you're only here for a small speck of time. So what does this have to do with ethics? So of course, meaning is quite distinct from morality. Most people have meaningful lives in the sense that I've just described, or many people can. Like lots of people can have meaningful lives in the sense I've described, but be really horrible people. Bad parents, political leaders who are bad, pick your political leader who's bad, people who perpetuate injustice, people who poison our community of ideas with ideas that make the community a worse place, that muddy our sense of what's true rather than clarifying it. Sometimes thinking about the meaning of life in the way I've described can make people more prone to making moral mistakes because people will invest their time and efforts in aggrandizing themselves rather than doing something that really meaningfully persists. And they'll do it in ways that are like inefficient or immoral. So for example, think of like monstrous political leaders from the past. Maybe they justified their misdeeds, their criminal actions on the grounds that it would bring glory to themselves or their groups, like the pyramids. Like, doesn't matter if we have to do unethical things to build the pyramids. Look at this monument to, our political leaders, I guess. Maybe they were right that that was a meaningful project, but it wouldn't be justified on moral grounds. Like, meaning doesn't justify immorality. Or more mundanely, think of philanthropists who donate to causes that on the conditions that the causes will carry their name. That's another kind of grasping for the sense of meaning. But if they're doing it in a way which distracts them from a more worthwhile endeavor, just because they want to invest in an endeavor that will visibly outlive them, then yes, they've done something that's in some sense a more meaningful act from the perspective of their own life. But if they could have prevented a greater amount of suffering or done more good by donating instead to something that was an efficient charity or an effective cause, then the pursuit of meaning has distracted them from the pursuit of the good. So in this way, the pursuit of meaning is really morally risky. Having children is another example of the moral risk of pursuing a meaningful life. So some people think that it's morally wrong to have children, and it's at least a risk because anytime you have kids, there's some chance that you would expose somebody to a life that is full of hardship and difficulty. If they're right, then these arguments, they don't threaten my claims about meaningfulness, but they make the decision to choose meaning more difficult because there's moral considerations that could weigh against meaning. But I don't think that a meaningful life is all that matters. I think morality matters too. So that's a difficult decision that people are going to have to grapple with in their own way. So I think that the thing that makes people special is that they are capable of this future-oriented meaning. But that doesn't mean that that doesn't tell us anything about morality. So when we think about what is the meaning of life, and I've been like future-oriented projects, that's the most important thing. How does that relate to morality? Here's one way in which it relates to morality. Don't interfere with people's future-oriented projects because like that is the source of their survival. That is the source of their meaning in life. This is a broadly kind of Kantian view, right? We see that people value their lives in this future-oriented way, in a way that requires more time, in a way that requires a sense of being able to knit themselves into these broader communities. And And we should infer from that that the worst thing that you can do to a person is to deprive them of that control over their own projects and plans and identities. And the worst thing that you can do is to treat a person in a way where they cannot be the author of their own lives in this way. So the most fundamental categories of moral wrongdoing, killing, violence, deceiving people, all of these are forms of wrongdoing that rob people of the ability to control their own futures and projects. So this was a broadly Kantian view. That's the guy on the top. And I'm a Kantian. That's the view of ethics that I hold, broadly. So reflecting on meaning in this way shows why the moral stakes are so high anytime you interfere with another person's plans and projects. In a sense, preventing people from making their own way in the world, excuse me, is what threatens the thing that matters most for their own survival. And if you treat people in this way, if you interfere with people in ways that they don't consent to, I think that you've deprived them of the opportunity to develop their own identities, and you've deprived them of the opportunity to live meaningful lives. On the other hand, as Peter Singer, say you're thinking, okay, how do I pick a future-oriented project to engage in? Peter Singer has some ideas. He was one of my dissertation advisors, so I figured I should put him up there. And I'm not a utilitarian in the way that he is, even though I disagree with him about moral theory. But I think he's right about this. And this is one thing that I've learned from him, which I used to be more skeptical of. There is a right answer about the kinds of projects that you can adopt in your life. And you can do it better or worse. And that right answer is that you should pick a project, if you're looking for a project to invest your life in, that yes, protects people from violence and remedies the forms of rights violations that Kant was worried about, but also addresses deprivation and addresses like natural threats that prevent people from living meaningful lives of their own. And by respecting people's attempts to live meaningful lives of their own, aiming to make the world as full of this kind of a value is one of the surest paths to a more meaningful life, right? So where does this leave us? One insight of Parfitt's was true. In a sense, people are dying all the time. That's because what matters for survival is a matter of degree. But on the other hand, we can survive all the time as well by investing our identities and intentions in projects that extend beyond ourselves. We often shy away from telling people how to live their lives. Part of this is because of what I said earlier, that it's really disrespectful to interfere with people. But when the stakes are so high, it's your whole life, even when we shouldn't interfere, even when we shouldn't tell people that they're making a mistake, we should maybe warn them about their mistakes that they could possibly be making. So for example, if a person's about to cross a rickety bridge, you ought to shout out the dangers. So if he does attempt the crossing, he knows what he's getting into. So this is my attempt to shout out the dangers of living in ways that I deem to be less meaningful. No one can force you to have kids or raise children or participate in a collective enterprise or contribute to a community of ideas. Each of these choices is incredibly morally risky, and I can see the reasons to be hesitant about engaging in any of them. But I'm telling you, the risks are worth it, and we should not overlook the risks of not doing them, especially in light of the fact that we're all mortal in this way. We are only here for a tiny speck of time, of all of the billions of people that could have been conceived and could have existed on the day that you were created. And it's billions of different people that could have been here. And you won the lottery, and you were the one that was created. And you are one of the few people who made it this far at this time. So it would be a disservice to you, I think, to leave you with the impression that all ways of living your life are created equal. That's not true. The poet Mary Oliver asks, "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? Tell me," I'll ask. "How will you find meaning?" Thank you very much.